Salve.
Salve.
How is
How
everybody
are
doing?
you?
I'm doing well,
I'm
thank you.
sorry.
Oh, no worries. All right. So I see Decimus is here too.
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, Salve.
Hi,
Oh,
Decimus. We can hear you.
Oh, nice. Normally I have to use my headphones. For some reason, I could hear you and you could hear me without using my headphones. I don't know what's changed.
So we can't see you. Now we can see you. There you are.
Now we can see you.
Yeah.
I went book shopping yesterday,
Oh, wow.
and amongst 3 large books, kind of fitting for today, I got a book about the culture and religion of the Carthaginians.
Nice.
Sweet.
Yeah. I have a huge library with Roman books, but I think I have about like 10 or 15 books about Carthage as well.
Yeah, I have a whole library on what I qualify as Rome and things related there too. And it includes, anybody that ever had contact with the Romans for more than about 3 minutes.
I'm just going to run and grab some water before we start.
Okay. So,
sorry.
I was just going to say, go ahead.
Okay, well, I just wanted to let everyone know I'm going to have to drop out a bit early for another meeting I have, but thought it would be good to at least see the start of this presentation, which sounds very good.
Cool.
Well, the first thing I want to do is apologize. I know we were supposed to do this in October, and, medical and other issues prevented it until now, and I kind of feel like a goofball, but I thank you for being so cooperative would be the word I would use.
Of course. I mean, we're more than happy to have anybody who can bring, value to this Sodalitas. So it's worth the wait, right? Now, do you have a presentation that you're going to be showing?
No, it's going to be a traditional lecture format.
Okay.
I don't have any displays or anything like that.
All right. In that case, we don't have to worry about sharing screens or anything, which is nice. So we're already recording, so you may take the floor as soon as you're ready.
All right. Well, there are no ladies present except my wife, who's in the background here. So, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your attendance at the Sodalitas. Today we are going to be discussing the nature of Carthaginian religion and its relation to Phoenician religion, and how Rome, in some ways, if you will, finished the job that the Israelites kind of started. Now, let's go back a bit and discuss Phoenician religion, or what you would find if you read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. The Phoenicians in the Old Testament, the people of modern day Lebanon and right in that area of the Levant, including parts of modern day Israel, were called Canaanites in the Old Testament. And they routinely get kind of, how shall I say that? Let's just say they get the bad end of the stick when you read the Old Testament. You read nothing good about the Canaanites, and you read nothing good about the Phoenicians or the Philistines. And if you look at modern day, for example, what's going on in Israel today, you will see how some modern day nationalists associate Philistines and Palestinians. Because of the fact that Syria Palestina, the old Roman name for the area, was derived from Philistia. The word the concept Palestina was derived from Philistia, and the the local religions that God said to the Israelites, go conquer that particular city and put every man, woman, and child, and in some cases even animals, every living creature to the sword. And for example, there was one part of the Old Testament where they said, yeah, let's go do that. And then he came back with the king and, he saved the king's life. And God was like, what did you think you were doing? I told you to put everybody to the sword. And they said, well, he's the king. And I thought, he deserved to be saved. And God was like, I didn't tell you to save him. He should have been killed. And so he was punished. The guy that should have killed the king was punished, not like eternally, but he went through some period of punishment for not doing what God had told him to do. Let's just say that the God of the Old Testament was a pretty vicious fellow. El was, Elohim, El, he was a war god. Okay. He was not the God that we see Christians and Jews and Muslims worshiping today. The eternal, all powerful, one God, nobody else. El was a war god. When he says, thou shalt have no other gods before me, for example, if I say to you, thou shalt have no other lecturers before me, does that imply that there are no other lecturers? No, it does not. It implies that I am telling you that I am the most important of your lecturers, and you will not have any others that you put in importance before me. Well, the same argument could be made, thou shalt have no other gods before me, does not imply that there are no other gods. It implies that I am your God, and you will do what I tell you to do. And no one else, no other God, will be before me. And so when the Israelites started worshiping other gods, well, let's just say that the God of the Israelites was less than pleased. It wasn't until much later in the Old Testament that you began to see the Hebrew prophets explaining God as the one God, the only God, nobody else. All other gods were by definition false. They were not gods. They were either non-existent or they were demons or they were whatever. But initially, when you go back far enough, the God of the Jews was exactly that, the God of the Israelites. He was not the only God. He was just the God of the Israelites. And the God of the Israelites ordered that the Israelites would go in and destroy the gods of the Canaanites, gods plural of the Canaanites. Now, the Philistines, pardon me, the Phoenicians were the ancestors of what we call all of a sudden my mind draws, Carthaginians. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. The Phoenicians were the ancestors of the Carthaginians, particularly the city of Tyre in modern Lebanon. It was from that city that these sailors set to sea in their, I guess, trust what proved to be trustworthy barks or ships, and they went out and faced what was then the very large unknown, the Mediterranean Sea. The idea of sailing beyond sight of land was kind of a new one at that point. No one had ever really done it, at least in our part of the world that we're studying. I mean, who knows what they were doing in Asia and whatnot at that time, where we aren't studying that. But in our part of the world of study, the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Carthaginians, the whole Mediterranean Sea, what the Romans later came to call Mare Nostrum, our sea. What the Romans later came to call that as our sea, you go back that far, nobody had ever sailed out of sight of land. So when the Phoenicians decide, you know what, we're going to get in our boats and we're going to leave and we're going to go west. It was almost like you could almost compare it to what American frontiersmen said, going California or bust. They would go west into the middle of nowhere. Now they were on land, but the idea was the same. We're going to go out there into unknown lands and unknown climes and unknown parts of the world, and we're going to risk everything, and we're just going to go out and kick some tail. And so when you see the Phoenicians make that decision, you really have to admire them in a way for doing that. And sure enough, they were able to go out and they were able to settle various places. And see, the Phoenicians and later the Carthaginians, but the Phoenicians at first had this concept of, okay, here's what we're going to do. We've got Tyre, our main city. We're going to go out. Oh, we found an island. Let's put what we call a factory on it. And a factory is not what we would call a factory today, but it was a factory it was a place known for where they would interact with the natives, if you will, and they would buy, sell, and trade, and then they would send it back to Tyre or whatever Phoenician city was in question. Pardon me while I blow my nose. I have sinus trouble. I apologize. Here, let me. Thank you so much. So they would go out and they would settle these areas, and invariably they would be small little areas. They would not be large cities. They would just be these small little areas that they would settle, and they would buy, sell, and trade with the local population, and then take a lot of it back to Tyre or whatever city we're dealing with, but we're dealing mostly with Tyre. Now, that changed a little bit when they went and founded the city of Utica. And Utica became its own city. They built their own walls. They had their own city privileges, very similar to that of Tyre. And then a little bit later, they settled what came to be known by the Romans as Carthage. And we've all read, or at least I hope we've all read, at least some of the Aeneid, where it talks about Dido, Queen of Carthage, and how she settled there because she was married to, I'm trying to remember the myth correctly. She was married to Pygmalion, and her brother killed her husband with the intent of getting all his riches. He was the high priest, and her brother was the king, and he decided to get all the wealth of the high priest, which was second only to his own. And so he killed, her husband, and she was able to kind of escape the city of Tyre by means of some subterfuge, if you will. And she was able to get on boats and go. And then when she got to the land of Carthage, they said, okay, what do you want from us? The natives said, what do you want from us? And she said, I want as much land as can be covered by this ox hide. She took an ox hide and she said, I want as much land as can be covered by this. They said, well, sure, that's not much. Of course, she was sneaky and she cut the ox hide into little tiny strips, and then she laid it out all across what would later become modern day Carthage, and it covered all of that area. So she got all of the area that would later become known as modern day Carthage. And of course, then a little bit later, she ran into Aeneas, the lost Trojan, if you will, and they fell madly in love. And then he became aware that he was destined for bigger and better things. And so he kind of left her in the lurch, if you will, kind of very, rather, what's the word? Uncharitable works, but also unchivalrous. There we go. He just left her all by herself. She was madly in love with him, but he's like, well, sorry, I'm going to go found a city up in Italy. Sorry about that, but see you later. And she was like, this is not going to go over well. The future of our two cities, no, this is not going to be good. And then she, if memory serves me well, she took her own life. But before she took her own life, she said, we're going to have, you're abandoning me, you're leaving me, and we're going to have eternal enmity. Now, that's all the myth. And myths are usually founded on a certain level of what we call fact, but it's usually a very small kernel of fact, and then it's expanded into this huge thing that later becomes a myth or a legend, if you will. Now, we will re-enter the world of fact at present, and that is, what was the religion of the Carthaginian? Well, the religion of the Carthaginian was a descendant of the religion of Tyre. Okay? And before I get into the more questionable elements, let's look at the one thing, let's look at the one person that they worshipped above all, above everything else. That was called Melkarth or Melkart. And he was king of the city, hence the beginning of the word M-E-L-Q or M-E-L-K. Now, mind you, of course, the Phoenician language did not have vowels any more than Hebrew has vowels. So you kind of have to hope you're right when you place the vowel points, and you have to hope that where you're placing them is correct and the points you're placing are correct. But so far as we know, the name Melkart, because we later learn that the Greeks affiliated Melkart with Hercules. They associated him with Hercules, and they even took his name with them, Melicertes, they called him. And when they were near Carthage, when they had cities near Carthage, Greek colonies, they would worship Melicertes or Melkart. Now, Melkart was king of the city. And Herodotus had gone himself to Tyre, and he had seen the temple of Melkart. And he was absolutely astounded by what he saw. It was this huge temple, and it had two pillars in front of it. One was made of solid gold. The other was green, he believed emerald, and it shone in the night with its own kind of light. It just shone throughout the entire night and lighted up the entire place. And that wasn't the only temple of Melkart. That was just the primary one. There were others throughout what we later would call the Carthaginian domains, in New Carthage and in a few other places. Now, in Carthage itself, oddly enough, he had no temple. But the reason he had no temple is because the entire city of Carthage was his temple. And so he was worshipped with a very pure, what R. Bosworth Smith calls a very pure, profound kind of worship. But they worshipped more than Melkart, and that's where it gets a little crazy, because R. Bosworth Smith associated their worship with that most distasteful form of sacrifice, human sacrifice. And if you read R. Bosworth Smith, who wrote two very interesting books in the late 1800s, I have them right here, in fact. He wrote first Carthage and the Carthaginians, and then he wrote a reduced he basically took this one and made it a smaller he made a smaller version of it, Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars. And that's the one that actually is somewhat more interesting because the action is a little bit, it moves faster. This one is more in-depth, detailed, kind of leaves you going, oh boy, wake me up. It's a good book, but it's long and it's detailed, and in certain points you're kind of snoring through it if you're not careful. But let me refer to some notes here for myself. I haven't memorized my everything. So R. Bosworth Smith makes the common assumption that Molech, or Melech, meaning king, was the god to whom was offered human sacrifice. However, to MLK, and remember, like I said, the Phoenician alphabet had no vowels. To MLK, wait a minute, where'd it go? That's what I did. Still getting used to using these devices. Okay. To MLK was said to mean as a sacrifice. Giving to MLK was giving to a sacrifice, as a sacrifice, not specifying what kind of sacrifice. And MLK, there is an argument put forth today that it did not mean Molech, that it meant something else, and they don't have the vowels, but they're saying that it referred to just making a sacrifice, and it did not necessarily imply human sacrifice. Now, the problem with that is that they've pretty much determined that, in fact, yes, there was human sacrifice, and part of it is the fact that in the Old Testament, when you read in the Hebrew scriptures Molech or Melech or Moloch, they're referring to a god. So when you hear it used under the Carthaginians, unless there's a very strong reason to say otherwise, one would be best assumed and best to say that, yeah, they're probably using it the same way. Now, come on, move. It's not moving. There we go. Now, one of the reasons they believe that the Carthaginians used human sacrifice is because of something they found in the ruins of Carthage that they call a Tophet. Now, in the Hebrew scriptures, the Bible makes Tophet or Topheth a place name. And what it was in the Hebrew scriptures was a place outside Jerusalem in the valley of Hinnom, or Gehenna, as would later be called. And in that valley, at Tophet, what they did is they indulged in human sacrifice to Molech. That is a known fact. The Bible refers to it. It's very clear. There is no argument on that. However, the word Topheth really meant a sacred enclosure, like a sacred grove of trees, if you will. The Asherah, the sacred grove of trees. And so if you look at the Old Testament, where it just says they went out to Topheth and indulged in human sacrifice, well, the Topheth they were talking about, yes, it was a place name. It did refer to a particular place in the valley of Hinnom, but it was a sacred grove out there. It wasn't just a spot or something. It was a sacred grove, an enclosure of a grove of trees, and it was out there that they did indeed indulge in sacrifice of human beings, particularly infants and small children. Now, did the Carthaginians practice human sacrifice? Yes, I think the only answer that can be given is that they did. In fact, it would appear that while human sacrifice fell out of use in Tyre and in the rest of what we call Phoenicia, it would appear that the Carthaginians continued to indulge in the practice all the way up to the destruction of the city in 146 BC at the end of the Third Punic War. However, that being said, it actually continued in secret even as late as Roman Carthage. When Rome built a new city on the remains of the old, it is believed that there were still some people indulging in human sacrifice in secret, because had they been caught, and I'm sure some of them probably were, had they been caught, human sacrifice was regarded by the Romans as murder. It was not tolerated. Even though, if you go way back to the very ancient beginning of Roman history, they also indulged in human sacrifice at one time, as did the Greeks, if you go far enough back. But they very soon gave it up and substituted animals in the place of humans. And that is one of the primary reasons why they found Carthage to be so disgusting, is that Carthage still engaged in human sacrifice long after Rome had given it up, Greece had given it up, even the Phoenicians themselves had given it up, yet the Carthaginians were still, at least according to our scholars Livy and Polybius, they were still practicing human sacrifice. Now, if one turns to 2 Kings 23:10, one sees reference to the Topheth and human sacrifice, passing the sons and daughters to Molech, through the fire to Molech. And it talks about how King Josiah put an end to that by desecrating the Topheth, as they call it, the Topheth. Apparently, there was only one. There were not multiple places around Jerusalem where this was done. It was only done in the one place in the valley of, Hinnom, later called Gehenna. And we get the idea of the word Tophet meaning hell in English. It's another name for hell because, how do I explain this? Okay. When you go to put your babies through the fire to Melech, to Molech, what they did is they had the god Molech. He was it was like a bronze statue of Molech, and he had his hands extended like this. I know the picture you can't really see me what I'm doing, but he had his hands extended in front of him, and they would lay the baby on the 2 hands of the god, and the fire was lit underneath already, and the baby, of course, would curl up, and then what they would do is the limbs would contract, and it looked as if the baby was laughing by the look on their face, as they later fell through. When their limbs contracted enough, they fell through the hands into the fire and were burnt up. And if you go to later Carthaginian practice, there's some debate about whether R. Bosworth Smith says that those who could would buy street children or poor children, the children of poor people, to give them in sacrifice so they didn't have to give their own. And the way it worked was, if I bought your child, you're the mother in this case, if I bought your child, you could not express any feeling or emotion whatsoever as you saw your baby be put to the fire of Molech. And if you did express any such thing, you forfeited payment for the child automatically. So no tears, no crying, nothing. And one of the ways they drowned out the screams of the children going through the fire is that they played loud flutes and drums, and they the by doing so you could no longer hear the screaming of the children. So it was rather horrific, one might say. Now let me just check my notes real quick before because I'm going to have to switch books in a second.
I probably ought to head out, so I'm going to say goodbye to everyone, but thank you, and look forward to watching this when it goes up, wherever it goes up.
All right.
Okay.
Well, it was a pleasure having you here. I wish you could have stayed for the whole thing, but we will see you later.
Okay, bye.
Some some scholars have argued that in fact the sacrifices in Carthage were made not to Molech, but rather that Molech or MLK meant engaging in a sacrifice to Baal Ham. Let me make sure I say it. Baal Hamon, the god of the sun. It was some scholars today believe that that's who they were sacrificing the babies to, was the god of the sun, rather than Molech, who some scholars say was not a god at all. Now, my studies show disagreement with that because, again, if you read in the Old Testament, which has proven itself to be a fairly good history if you make allowance for the fact that it is religious history. And so a, a king that might not be important for secular purposes may be talked about at length in the Old Testament because he was a good religious man, whereas a king who may have been very significant historically is passed over very quickly in the Old Testament because he was an evil individual. And he did not do something worthy of being commented on in what was essentially a religious history book. But what I have seen in the Old Testament shows that Molech or Moloch or Melech, king, that it was indeed referring to a god. So I will argue with the scholars who say that no, MLK meant simply as a verb to create, engage in a sacrifice to Baal Hamon. Now there may be some truth to that, but you know, again, I think they were engaging in a sacrifice to the king, if you will, to the king of the gods as they understood him to be. And they have done some study of the Tophet that they have found in Carthage. And they call it Tophet only because that's what they call the same one in Jerusalem. So they decided to go ahead and name it that in Carthage. They have no idea what the Carthaginians called it. Did the Carthaginians call it a Tophet? Well, maybe, maybe not. But that is a modern day application of a term where they go back to the Bible, they see the word Tophet, they say, okay, we think this was used for the same purpose, so let's go ahead and call it a Tophet. And in all the Carthaginian cities round about the western part of the Mediterranean, they have quote unquote Tophets, if you will. But again, they're using that word simply as an identifier based on the Old Testament word itself. Now, they have done some study of the Tophet in Carthage, and they have found some interesting things, and it kind of leaves a bit of a question. Did the Carthaginians engage in human sacrifice? Because most of the babies that they found, most of the ashes and scarred bones, the burnt bones that they found, indicate babies that were born premature or were stillborn. And the odd thing is that a lot of times these babies were also put in the same urn as children a little bit older, say 6 months to a year old. And so the argument has been made that in fact they were not killing children in sacrifice. In fact, they were taking children who had died, whether by stillbirth or by being born premature and not living, or young children who died, say, after a year of life or even less, sometimes as old as age 6, but mostly under a year. Um, and these children died naturally, which, given a infant mortality rate of 35 to 40%, there might be something to that. But still, most of the scholars today seem to continue to accept the arguments that have been made that, in fact, yes, Carthage did indulge in human sacrifice. Now, they did not do it as frequently as did their ancestors. Their ancestors made a regular habit out of it to the point where, like I said, the Israelites believed they were sent by their God to put these people to the sword for their horrible practices, if you will. Whereas in Carthage, it appears that this was only done when there was one of two things: either A, severe danger to the state, when the state was severely threatened, well, for example, by the Romans in the Punic Wars, and by others whom they fought. Because Carthage didn't just fight the Romans. That's one thing we must understand. Carthage had a lot of wars that had nothing to do with the Romans. In fact, there's a whole book out there that I've looked at called Carthage's Other Wars. And it's all about the many other wars that Carthage fought with people round the Mediterranean, particularly in Africa, of course, but people that were not the Romans. Because oftentimes we think of the Carthaginians and we think of them only as foils for the good Romans, if you will. We think of the Romans as the good guys, versus the Carthaginians as the bad guys, the cowboys and Indians, if you will, of their era. And we make certain exceptions. We think of Carthaginians as evil and bad. We make certain exceptions for their best generals, and we think of like Hannibal passing through the Alps and all that. We think of, wow, that guy was really brilliant. He was a good guy. And we give credit to some of their other generals, one of whom was Hannibal's father, and one of whom was his, I believe, his brother or his cousin. Anyway, the Barcids, the Barcids in Spain ruled Spain, and they were in charge of the military. And so, they were the ones that were tasked with going to Rome and trying to fight the Romans. And of course, they often won the battle but lost the war. And that's what ultimately happened, is they lost the wars and Carthage was eliminated. Carthago delenda est, as Cato would say. Carthage must be destroyed. And he was ultimately proved right. They did what he suggested, and they put Carthage completely to the sword, with the exception of about 50,000 people who were sold off into slavery. And then not only did they burn down the city, but they even strew salt about the fields so that nothing could ever grow there again. But as far as the whole human sacrifice element, it was done in Carthage under times of great danger to the state or times of great celebration. So when the Carthaginians had an unlooked for, something that was radically successful that they had not planned on, something that happened that made them go, whoa, wait a minute, what happened here? we did a lot better than we thought we were going to do. Well, then they would turn and they would go to their gods in thanksgiving, and in so doing, they would engage in human sacrifice, either to plead for salvation of their city or to thank the god for the salvation of the city. And let me think for just a second. I need to think. Okay. So, the Romans in many ways were essentially like the Israelites. The Israelites were told to go and destroy the Phoenicians, put them to the sword because they engaged in these practices. And the Romans essentially finished the job that the Israelites had started. In fact, I remember hearing a Lutheran pastor friend of mine who said, really, that's what the Romans were doing. They were doing the job that the Israelites should have done, but didn't, because they didn't want to sail away from the coast of, they didn't want to sail out of sight of land. Basically, they were a little afraid of leaving, sight of land and sailing off into the Mediterranean. Now, let's talk for a moment. We've talked about the religion of the Carthaginians. We've talked about the religion of the Phoenicians. Let's talk a little bit more about the nature of the Carthaginians. They were in so many ways the children of Tyre. The people of Tyre got in their ships, left sight of land, and founded all these areas. Well, so did the Carthaginians. They left sight of Carthage. They went to Spain. They founded cities in Spain on the coast and even further inland. And not only that, but they even went outside what was then called the Pillars of Hercules. Now, what were the Pillars of Hercules? The Pillars of Hercules were basically the Rock of Gibraltar on one side and Morocco on the other side. They were what we would today call the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. Well, for them, it was not an entrance, it was an exit. Now, you will note that out of the entire library, literally library, collections of books, out of the entire collection of literature that the Carthaginians had created in 700 years, none of it survived except for a very few items. In fact, the Romans, in one of their less intelligent acts, turned over the libraries of Carthage to their allies in Africa. Rather than taking it back to Rome themselves, they just said, here, you take it. And we don't know what happened to that huge collection afterwards. We have no idea. But the Romans did save a couple of items. One was a 28-volume treatise on farming. I forget the name of the individual who wrote it, but actually the Romans, being as practical as they were, the Senate ordered that this 28-volume collection be translated from Punic into Latin and saved. Unfortunately, we don't have a copy of it today. We do know that it was saved, for the benefit and use of the Romans, but for one of many reasons, it has not survived to the present date. There was one other thing that was saved, however, and that was the logbook of a certain admiral named Hanno. And Hanno and his ships had left Carthage and had gone through the Pillars of Hercules and then south. And they had gone all the way down the coast of Africa, all the way down to the Cape of Good Hope, down in South Africa today. And then they turned around and they went back because they were running out of provisions. But they made notation of everything they saw in this logbook. And at one point, in fact, they had gone ashore in what we would today call the Gambia. And they ran into a group of what we believe today are chimpanzees because they could not get the males. They captured some of the females, and they described the females as hairy all over the body, and how they could not get the females to come on board ship with them to take them back to Carthage because the females were too afraid. So they ended up killing them and just leaving them there. But it is believed today that they did not, in fact, run into people. The people they ran into were actually chimpanzees. But that is the first time we see I don't want to say Europeans because Carthage was in Africa. So it was the first time we see that people from that area of the world ever left the Mediterranean area and went elsewhere. It is also known that the Carthaginians went north as well. They went outside the Pillar of Hercules, up the coast of Portugal, around the coast of northern Spain, and up through France, through the English Channel. They stopped in England. They explored that area where they found a lot of tin, if you will, and they even had relations where they imported tin from these people. So, you know, when you look at the success of the Carthaginians and who they deserve a lot more credit than Rome gives them. Rome, of course, saw them as the enemy. And see, that's the fundamental question you have to ask yourself. And perhaps the whole point of this lecture is to indicate we know nothing about the Carthaginians except what has been left to us by the Romans. Certainly the Carthaginians didn't call the wars the Punic Wars. We don't even know what they called themselves. We know that the Romans called them Punic, but they may not have called themselves that. They may have had an entirely different name for themselves. We don't know. And certainly they wouldn't have called it the Punic War any more than the Vietnamese called the Vietnam War the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese call it the American War. That's their name for that war, the American War. Well, that makes sense from their perspective. They were fighting the Americans. So what else are they going to call it? So certainly the Punic Wars are not going to be called that by the people themselves, by the Punic people themselves. They're not going to say, oh, we fought ourselves when they were fighting the Romans. Presumably, they probably called them the Roman Wars or something to that effect. We'll never know. And that's the fundamental nature of the problem when you are studying this subject. We get only what the Romans give us. And fortunately for us, Polybius, who is our primary source of knowledge of Carthage and the Carthaginians and the wars that were fought, we're fortunate that he's actually a reasonable historian. He does take some sides. He is a friend of Rome, you can see that, but he's a fairly objective historian nonetheless. And, I think that's what we need to try to be today. And as Nova Romans, we are inclined to take the Roman side of things, as we should be. But at the same time, let us remember that every time you see people not getting along, there are reasons that each side has. And those reasons may be different on the one side than the other. And we look again at the Vietnam War and we think, what were the Vietnamese reasons for fighting that war? Why did they fight the Americans? What was their rationale behind it? Why didn't they just say, we'll stay here up in North Vietnam and we'll let you guys do your thing in South Vietnam and we won't fight you? Why did they fight? Well, we know why they fought because we've done some, we've read their literature, we've read their material, and of course they still exist and they can tell us today. Unfortunately, there's very little that the Carthaginians can tell us because A, they don't exist, and B, even their literature in almost all cases has been eliminated. So, if we, even with their religion, when we have basically determined, yes, they did indulge in human sacrifice, and that's horrid, no one's suggesting that it's anything else, but it would be nice to know from their perspective what they were doing rather than just from the Roman perspective and rather than just from the Greek perspective. So I think that kind of rounds off what I have to say today. And now, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them and try to answer them to the best of my ability. Please fire ahead. Let me get some coffee real quick here.
All right.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that talk. Claudius, do you have some questions?
I actually have a few, but I'm wondering if you have a few questions, why don't you start and then I could finish, or vice
Okay.
versa.
Yeah, so I guess my primary question was, so we focused a lot on the particulars of Moloch and perhaps of Baal as well, but I'm wondering if there is any um, like what exists, if anything, about other gods and goddesses in the Punic pantheon, because I know, so the one thing that I am aware of is that there was a settlement on Sicily that had a sort of Venus cult, perhaps an Ishtar cult, that was related to uh, Carthage. But I'm wondering what else we know, if there's anything.
That's the problem, we don't.
Hmm.
We know about Melkart, or whom the Greeks associated with Hercules. We know about various forms of Baal, Baal Hamon, the god of the sun. We also know about the goddess of the moon. I don't recall what they called her right offhand. I apologize. But we know about the goddess of the moon. And we do know a little bit, but very little, about Carthaginian religion other than what the Romans told us. And what the Romans told us was they killed people. And therefore, their religion was really not worth discussing because it had human sacrifice. So they really didn't do a lot of in depth study of Carthaginian religion. They studied until they got to the point where they found that they were indulging in human sacrifice. And the Romans were so disgusted and so repulsed that they didn't go any further with it. They just figured, no, we're going to annihilate these people because that's disgusting. That was one of their many reasons for wanting to annihilate them. There were others as well. But what we have to realize is that the Punic Wars, which were fought for a variety of economic and other reasons, they were also fought for very religious reasons. These people are disgusting, said the Romans. Look what they do. So they didn't want to explore any further. What we know about Carthaginian religion basically stems from what we know about Phoenician religion.
Mm-hmm.
And most of what we know about Phoenician religion, we get from the Bible. So my encouragement would therefore be we'd be here all day if I wanted to have a discussion about the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, if you will. We'd be here all day if I wanted to have that discussion with you. And perhaps we can do that at some point, but pardon me, we have a dog. I apologize. Hold on one second.
Okay.
I'm sorry. He gets a little yappy at times. He's a small dog.
No worries.
But
All right. Yeah, I think that answers that though. Claudius, do you have questions? You said you had questions.
Yeah, but I have a few actually. First of all, I've actually been to numerous Tofets. in Carthage, Sardinia,
Mhm.
and actually in Mosia in Sicily.
They had a
And
variety of them in various cities, yes.
I rem I remember also seeing some inscriptions. Normally, I mean, there's not much to them, but I mean, they won't have the name of the child, but they'll have the name of the parent or whoever is paying for the stone.
Mhm.
They'll have the name of a deity, and I believe they'll also have some formulaic wording about like that um, it was set up because they were something happened. I forgot what it's called. One of the like an ex voto thing that like the deity helped me in some way, and I'm setting this up. So I'm wondering how does that really tie into the ashes of small bones? Because like I said, I mean, this is not just something that happened in Jerusalem or in Carthage. It happened in many, many places. And when the Romans came in, it completely, as far as I remember, this completely stopped. So like the Tophits, I mean, the settlements don't, many settlements just continued over time, but not the Tophits themselves.
And
Right.
I had kind of a question that links in with that as well,
Go
which
ahead.
is, do we know who, like, do we have any idea who was doing the sacrificing? So like,
They believe, at least in Carthage, that the children were the children of the elite.
okay,
It was the rulers and the high ranking priests, the high ranking kings, not kings, but the Sufis, the high ranking members of the Senate. Remember, okay, let's do a small discussion, less than 5 minutes. Carthaginian government. What was it? Well, there were two people called Sufis, which translates somewhat unfortunately as judge. If you go back to the same term in the Bible, they translate the word as, we get the book of Judges from it. Shofetim, Shofetim, judge. So the Suffit, as they are called in Carthage, translates roughly as judges, and there were two of them. And the Romans liked to compare them to their two consuls that the Romans had in the Roman Republic. You have two consuls, you have two Suffites. Now, underneath the Suffites, you had the Senate. And the Senate was initially had a lot more power than it later did, because later on you see the development of the 100, which was actually 104. And it was a council of 104 people, the greatest leaders, the richest, the wealthiest, the most influential people in the city. And when they came into existence, they basically took they took power. The Senate continued to have theoretical power, but really they didn't do anything that the 104 didn't tell them to do. The 104, the Council of 100, became the predominant governing body of Carthage at that point. And so the people that were doing the sacrificing were, in Carthage at least, high ranking members of the government and priesthood. These people, the children were children of the elite. They weren't just random, you didn't get some random guy like me that says, you know what? I just had a great thing happen to me. I'm going to take my kid and sacrifice him to, the gods. People like me didn't do that. It would be like, in this country, you would have somebody say like President Biden, or some member of the Congress, something nice, something fabulous would happen, or they'd feel very threatened, as I said, something threatening to the state. So then you would get the leadership, say, in comparing it, our Congress, our president, etc., offering sacrifice to the gods. It wasn't people like us, normal, everyday folk.
Okay.
So, I mean, I'm wondering though, because I've read a lot about Carthaginian history and like also some scholarship. And some people said, oh yeah, the Carthaginian religion um, lasted until like the third or fourth century AD. And then
In secret, it did.
I'm trying to look at the evidence though, and I've been to the majority of Roman provinces, and I've been to many places where the Carthage or the Phoenicians and also Punics lived, and you just don't see that not only like religious syncretism, but also the steady evolution between like a Greek city and it becomes Roman after hundreds of years, with like and sometimes some cities they kept the Greek architecture or Greek layout or what have you. But what I've seen is that with very few exceptions, like let's say in Libya or what have you, just the Roman or sorry, the Punic religion really died out in public. And so you don't really see the syncretism, you don't see the symbols. Now there are some minor exceptions here and there. Um, I I know that like in Lebanon, um, there were still some symbols of Tanit later in Roman times. But I mean, these are really exceptions to the rule. And one interesting thing is, so Carthage was destroyed, but I mean, there's so much territory in Punic. So the Phoenicians and the Punics. If you look at the beginning of the first Punic War, massive amount of territory, and it's just like the civilization really just died out, which didn't really happen with like the Celts or the Germans because they were much more incorporated into the Roman Empire. And I was just wondering, like why and like how did this break happen? Because I mean, I don't think every Phoenician and Punic person was killed, but immediately, they just their public symbols and public way of life was changed immediately.
The studying I did, okay, and I'm just telling you the work I did in preparation for this lecture and what I had seen done, what studying I had done before over the years. And I haven't been, first, let me be honest, I haven't been as lucky as you. I haven't been able to go see these Tophet for myself. I wish I could trade shoes with you for a minute because I would love to have that experience. I really would, Decimus. That would be great. But unfortunately, no. But what I observed is that the Romans, see, when the Romans conquered Greece or when the Romans conquered Germania or other areas, they did just incorporate those areas into the empire. And in the case of Greece, they admired what they saw of Greece so much that in some ways they tried to out Greek the Greeks, if you will. They took their religion, they associated their own gods with Greek gods to the point where, one thinks of Jupiter, one thinks of Zeus. Okay. One thinks of Diana, one thinks of Artemis. One cannot separate these deities from each other because they're so identified with each other. I mean, as an example, in my own bedroom where I keep statues of some of the Roman deities, they're actually many of them have Greek names down beneath, like Hera rather than Juno, and Hestia rather than Vesta, the Vestal Virgins and so forth. I keep these in my room. I won't go into detail, but my own religious beliefs are very complex, and they include some belief in the pagan deities. It gets a little complicated, but we won't go there. Anyway, when they conquered these areas, they saw a lot that they admired. So they didn't really destroy the culture of the area that they conquered. the Germania, Greece, Britannia, Hispania. They didn't destroy the culture because there was enough to admire that they just basically left it alone. When they conquered the Carthaginians, they did every single thing they could to completely annihilate every last vestige of culture remaining. To the point where, out of all the literature that developed between the year 814, which is the traditional founding of the city for Carthage, Carthage was traditionally founded 814 BC. From 814 all the way to 146, all the literature that was created by the Carthaginians was eliminated, with the exception of a 28 volume thing about how to be a good farmer, basically, a logbook of an admiral, and then I think there were one or two more items. Those are the two that were more relevant to what I was studying. But I think there were one or two more items, and that's it. That's all. So yeah, they do say that some Carthaginian religious practices continued even as late as the 3rd or 4th century AD, but they were so underground that there's actually very little evidence to, we can learn very little of what they actually did because it was so far underground, because if they were caught doing it, they were severely punished by the Roman imperial state. That it wasn't tolerated. Human sacrifice and anything like it was just not tolerated. So that's really the best answer I can give you. You, in fact, may have somewhat more knowledge of this than I do just because of your extensive travels.
No, I mean it's always been this open question because, for instance, when you go to southern Spain, there's a lot of different um, Phoenician cities, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of archaeological ruins, and not all of, like, obviously these were also some of the places were war zones, but not everybody was killed. I mean, just like in Caesar's wars in Gaul, not like, okay, there's plenty of people getting killed in wars, but not everybody. But like you still
Right.
see a lot of Gaelic deities like um hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards. But
Right.
You just don't see that with, and I mean there's definitely still local population there. So I find the break like very interesting because when people say, Carthage must be destroyed, yeah, the city was, but like I mean, there's many other cities that had the same, religion, the same heritage
Well,
as them.
the break that there is, where you see the break with, with Carthaginian religion, or, and see, most of the cities that you're talking about in southern Spain and in that area, most of them were not so much Phoenician as they were Carthaginian. Okay. The
That's
Phoenicians settled Utica. The Phoenicians settled Carthage. The Phoenicians settled a few other places, but the Carthaginians were the ones that settled what we would today call Cartagena in Spain, New Carthage. The Carthaginians settled Gades. The Carthaginians settled all these little areas in Spain. All these areas, there's one area in France that I believe Marseille, modern day Marseille, was settled initially by the Carthaginians. All of these areas were settled not by the Phoenicians, but by the Carthaginians, who were themselves settled by the Phoenicians. But because their religion was found to be so distasteful by the Roman ruling authorities after they were conquered, their religion was put a stop to under, if you were caught indulging in human sacrifice, you yourself were put to death. Just eliminated, usually by very painful means, crucifixion or some similarly painful method. Because you were not a citizen of the empire, and therefore you could be put to death in some of the most brutal ways possible. And people obviously did not want that happening to them. So any practice of Carthaginian religion that continued at all was by definition done in secret. That's the biggest thing. You don't see continuation of a lot of things that were Carthaginian simply because Carthaginian religion, civilization, culture, way of life, all of it was deemed to be so disgusting, so repulsive. They wanted to eliminate every single thing they could about it. And if they caught you indulging in any of it, may God have mercy on you. Because let's just say you better give your soul to the gods because your butt just went to Rome.
And just one minor point, I remember actually reading about Hannah, and
Yeah.
I don't remember anybody making the claim that he went to South Africa. I know it's ambiguous because I mean there was like some mountains and a few descriptions, but I thought some scholars think it was more of like, I don't know, West Africa, you know, like I don't know, Senegal or Senegal or further down the coast, but I don't remember hearing a claim about South Africa.
I do believe he was the one who went down to, because I remember reading our friend R. Bosworth Smith was talking about how he went down to the Cape of Good Hope, and then that's where he turned around and went back north. Was then. Now, maybe other scholars might disagree with our friend R. Bosworth Smith. R. Bosworth Smith was a well-known British scholar at the end of the 19th century. And that is a claim he made. It is entirely possible that some modern day scholars might disagree with him. I'm taking my information from that book. You know, but yeah, that's the knowledge I have to present to you. Now, if you've seen other stuff, I'm not going to argue with you. You know.
I was just curious. I was just curious.
Oh, legitimate question. Entirely legitimate question. I'm just telling you what I read and what I discovered for my purposes of, preparing for this discussion today.
Sure. But yeah, that's it from my side. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your questions, and I appreciate the fact that you've obviously had your own research that was lucky enough to have actually been on site, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, I mean even this year I went all over Sardinia, and
Wow.
very interesting, very
Well,
interesting place.
where do you live?
Germany.
Okay, Germania, nice. See, yeah, I live in the middle of Iowa, so it would be a little harder for me to get to these areas than it is for you. But no, you might even consider giving the next lecture on this topic because it sounds like you in some ways are better prepared than I am.
I did give a lecture some months ago.
Yeah.
I went to Lycia, so it's southwestern Turkey, and that was very interesting for me. 29
Nice.
different places in the span of 10 days.
Wow. Do you have any questions, Richard?
No, I at this point I don't think so. I really appreciate you taking the time to give this lecture, and so you're also now formally a part of the Sodalitas. You're on the list. So if you want to come by in the future at any of our meetings, so we have a meeting pretty much once a month, and we try and have some kind of talk or discussion or a book reading or something like this. And so the one thing we haven't done yet, and this is something that we'll probably do offline for this time around, is to discuss what we would like to do next time.
Okay.
So please be on the lookout for an email through the Sodalitas Barbarica listserv, kind of for discussion about what we might want to do for January.
Okay.
All right.
And if, I would volunteer to do further discussions, not necessarily Carthage, but, I would volunteer to do further discussions on, of this nature if you'd like.
Sounds great.
What about like Jerusalem? Because I mean, are you more of a biblical scholar?
Yes. Yes, that tends to be my area of strength. When I decided that I was going to do this, I took it from kind of, as you probably observed, I took it from kind of a biblical perspective. Because that's where Phoenicia first starts, is in the Old Testament. That's where we get most of our information about the Phoenicians, whom the Israelites called the Canaanites.
Yeah, so we actually just had we had a reading by Josephus. I think that
Hmm.
was was that September probably, or
I'm
maybe
not sure
August.
because it's we had a gap of a few months,
Yeah,
so
Yeah,
we did.
I'm not exactly
My
sure the
and
timeline.
that was my fault. I
No
apologize.
worries.
yeah. I mean, we've all got plenty of things going on, so it's not a huge deal. Um, but we would like, to continue and to have meaningful discussions every month if possible. So, ancient Israel is definitely within our wheelhouse, um, and
Oh
it's
yeah,
something that we've
there's
discussed
there's
already.
so much there's so much about ancient Israel. Not only like the Jewish wars, it's also like before. I mean, you have Isla Capitolina. I mean, there's so many revolts. I mean, I like
Yes,
even if we decide to do like a topic, there'd just be so many possibilities that you could go with in
Yeah,
my
Jerusalem. It's
Hebrew
kind of
name
like,
my Hebrew name is Yaakov. Okay, my Hebrew name is Yaakov. I am a Jew. My religious beliefs are not specifically Jewish. Like I said, they're rather complex. But my Hebrew name is Yaakov, and I have studied Judeo is Judeo-Israelite Hebrew history, if you will.
mm,
I have studied all. If it not, I would want to have say 2 or 3 months to prepare. But if we would like to, if you would like, I can prepare some, you know, another lecture of this nature, but on that subject matter, if you would like. I would
yeah,
be
I think that
more
would be
than happy to present the knowledge that I've gained over many, many years of studying scripture and, also Josephus. And
sure.
yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, we can set an appointment, we can set a date for that now if we like. Richard, again, not next month. I would like more time to prepare than that. But
yeah. I
uh,
think perhaps maybe like March or April might be a good.
okay, let's make it March.
Okay, yeah, because then that gives us January and February to have other discussions or other kinds of readings.
Hmm. Hmm. Unless you think April would be better. Would you like to have a third month in there to have other discussions?
Well, I mean, at this point we're pretty open, so
Yeah.
I tell you
we
what,
don't we really plan by month, so it's not
why don't we prepare for April?
okay.
Let's prepare for April. I will have something to present. I will send, a private email or two to you once obviously I'm not just going to have a discussion open ended about, Jewish history. I'm going to want to narrow it down to
Yeah, we definitely
something,
have to narrow it.
you
I
know,
What
especially
about
especially as it relates to Rome. I would want to narrow it down to something related to Rome.
what about Jerusalem, Isla Capitolina, Jerusalem under the Romans? Or is that too easy because it's already Roman then?
Yeah, it's probably a little too easy. I think we'd want to really discuss, for example, I think what might be an interesting topic, and this is just a suggestion, we can
mm,
narrow this down later, but for example, the Maccabees and how they fought off the Greeks. I forget which particular Greek group it was, but the
the
Antiochans.
Seleucids.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
Seleucids. Or wasn't it? Yeah, the Seleucids. They fought off the Seleucids to only later fall victim to the Romans, if you will.
yeah,
And it might be an interesting discussion to have to discuss how they fought off the Seleucids, but only later wound up under Roman domination. That might be an interesting topic we could have.
Yeah, definitely. And
Why don't we plan on that? I'll be more than happy to give a discussion of the end of Seleucid rule, the Maccabean rule, all the way through to the fall to the Romans.
Would it be possible to do like a PowerPoint presentation to add some, like have some slides as well? Because I think slides are always really good, especially if we post this on YouTube. It's good for like the home audience to really, I don't know, digest the
Hold on
presentation.
1 second. Don't go in. Yes, my wife just said she can help me with that.
cool.
So yes.
Okay.
See,
That'd be great.
let me be honest with both of you and anyone else who wants to attend. I'm one of those classic guys. When I give a lecture, I just stand up there at the chalkboard. And, I went to college 30 odd years ago. And the professors I had were the hardcore traditionalists. They stood up on the podium. We all sat down in the classroom. They lectured. We took notes and we did what we were told. How we were told, when we were told. If they told us to jump, the only question permitted might have been, "How high, sir?" So that, I admit, is one of my weaknesses, that I tend to be very old school in how I present things. But since my wife has so graciously volunteered to assist me, yes, we can do some PowerPoint type presentations, and we can make this even more interesting. I'm more than happy to do that as long as I have her help, because I won't be able to do it by myself.
That sounds great.
Great. I actually have to run.
Yeah,
We
I
have to
think we all
discuss
have
about
to get
next
going.
month. We haven't discussed about month. Well, we could just write in the group.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I think we're gonna have to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alrighty.
All right. Well,
thank you.
let's plan for April, and we'll go from there.
Yep. And I also just wanted to say happy Saturnalia, since Saturnalia starts today.
That is today.
So-
Same to you.
So
And I will say that the gods of Rome and all the other gods that exist seem to have been with me on this lecture. I would like to think I did a decent job. I hope you guys agree.
Oh yeah, definitely. So that'll be all for today, and I hope you all have a good holiday season. And I will talk to you all in January.
All right.
Same to
And
you.
online.
Salvete.
Salvete.
Salvete.